All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the 2025 Michigan State University Extension Field Crops Virtual Breakfast Series. I'm very happy to be joining you today as our first host of the series. My name is Steve Whittington. I'm a field crops educator with MSU Extension, based in the Montcalm County area, covering the west central region of the state. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the series, Dr. Christy Sprague, with a discussion on early season weed control considerations. Christy, go ahead and take it away. I'll stop sharing my screen.
And good morning, everyone. Happy to be here this morning. I know we're all kind of getting antsy for the season to start. I know it's March 27th, and a lot of times we're starting to think about what do we need to do to get started. And one of the things I really wanted to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about early season weed control, and there's a few different topics I wanted to cover. First off, we'll just kind of touch base on reminding everybody about some of the different options we have to make sure that we have good weed control early in the season, and discuss some of the things that we should be planning for. Additionally, right around the corner, we'll be making weed control applications for in our winter wheat, particularly if there wasn't a fall herbicide applied. We're going to be looking at the next month or so, month and a half, into getting those spring applications on winter wheat to help provide control. And we'll talk about some of the lookouts for that and some of the different information for different options. And one other thing I wanted to talk a little bit more about is termination of cover crops. That's usually a pretty big topic as we start moving into the next month. And last year we did a field day that kind of went through some different timings of termination for some of these cover crops. And we looked at a lot of different cover crops and a lot of different herbicides. And we feel like we've got some pretty good recommendations on some things that we would like to share with you today. So, as most of us know, it is really important to make sure that when we're planting any crop that we start with a weed-free seed bed. And the main reason for that is to make sure that we're getting the most um, out of that emerging crop, whether it's soybeans or corn, sugar beets, any of those, any of the crops that we're growing, dry beans a little bit later on, but making sure that we plant into a weed seed or weed-free seed bed. And there's a couple different ways that we can do that. Obviously, one of those ways is by tillage. And when we start thinking about tillage, there's a few things that we can, just set aside and think about. One of the things is obviously tillage is much better to control small weeds, particularly when the soil conditions are ready. Many times, sometimes we might want to get a little antsy and get into that field when they're still a little bit wet. When we do that, we can cause compaction as well as we don't get as good a weed control. So a couple things to consider. Additionally, some of the weed species, particularly ones that may have been that came up this last fall, maybe some things like horseweed or mare's tail that might get some bigger size, particularly as we move closer towards May, are going to be harder to control with just tillage. So in some cases, you may want to consider doing some sort of a burn down application. Additionally, this last fall, we had quite a bit of winter annual growth, so things like chickweed can also cause some problems. So, in those cases, many times you may want to put some sort of an application out there before you do some tillage. Usually, we generally say try to do that around 7 days or so. You can probably get away with 3 days, but trying to make sure that any of those big weed mats that maybe have had gotten a lot of winter grow or winter or fall growth, you may want to try to control that way. Another thing to just consider is the type of tool that you use. I know a lot of us have vertical tillage tools in areas where it was wet last fall. You might want to use those to try to level out the ground. But a lot of times, just remember those aren't going to be our most effective weed control tools. And particularly when we're looking at things like controlling mare's tail and really some of those more aggressive tools, tillage tools, whether it's, some of our soil finishers that have a lot of different either shovels, different things to help bury some of those small seeded weeds like horseweed will also be helpful. What I thought I would do is just kind of cover some of the more effective burn down treatments that we've encountered, particularly in soybeans, And usually when I think of any sort of burn down application, I'm always trying to make sure I have something in there to control glyphosate or ALS resistant horseweed, mare's tail, because that's one of those weeds that continually pops up, particularly in our no-till acres, in particularly in soybeans, but it can show up in corn and some of the other things. Some of these different programs can be used both in corn and soybeans, so those are a couple things to consider. When we start thinking about some of the options that we do have, some of the key things that I always think about, particularly these are for any soybean trait, so applied before those soybeans come up, is 2,4-D. In particular, if we're looking at any soybean trait, we're looking at using a pine 2,4-D ester. In general, we're going to go ahead and probably keep the glyphosate into any of our burn down applications to help control things like chickweed or henbit or some of these other weeds might be coming up. Additionally, a lot of times we might have some manual bluegrass that might be an issue. Sharpen at an ounce prior to planting soybeans is also a good option for controlling any of that mare's tail that would be present at the time. Remember, with the use of sharpen, we want to make sure that we have a methylated seed oil. And in general, with glyphosate, anytime we're having any of those mixes, we're going to want AMS. We've also looked at Liberty as a burn down application, and that can be fairly effective, particularly on horseweed. We usually generally see it being a little bit more effective as our temperatures get warmer, so consider that. There is a new formulation out there called Liberty Ultra that's just basically the resolved isomer, and what that's going to do is just kind of change your use rates that you'd be looking at. In general, as we talk about trying to manage some of our resistant weeds, in particular things like horseweed or water hemp later in the season, we're usually trying to figure out, okay, well, we're better off if we have two effective sites of action. And over here on the right-hand side, you can see things like tank mixtures with Sharpen and 2,4-D, again, including that glyphosate and MSO has been very effective. So just depending on what kinds of pressure you have out there, if there's a lot of mare's tail, some of these combinations might be more effective. Sharpen plus Liberty. We've also looked at Liberty and metribuzin, and the metribuzin does provide us some post-emergence activity on that glyphosate-resistant horseweed or mare's tail. And in the case of the metribuzin, that's also very effective from a residual standpoint. And then we've also looked at gramoxone plus metribuzin, and those have worked well. One of the things I do want to point out is when we start thinking about a lot of our burn down treatments prior to planting soybeans, just remember if you are not in an enlist system and you're using 2,4-D ester, you can go up to a pint, but you need to at least make that application 7 days prior to planting. So just a couple things to keep in mind. A couple other things, if you're in the Enlist D3 system, we have some more options that we can actually apply all the way up to planting and past soybean emergence. And that's the 2,4-D formulations of Enlist 1 or Enlist Dual, which has the combination of that choline salt of 2,4-D plus glyphosate. And in the case of some of the tank mixes you might want to look at, it is really important that you check out that Enlist tank mix option on the website. And we have a lot of good information in our weed control guide that outlines that. In addition to some of these options, there are a lot of other herbicides that have burn down activity, and we do have two fairly good tables in the weed control guide, and those have been updated for the 2025 season. If you're looking at, if somebody says, hey, well, what does Reviton do in corn? You can look at some of those things. And that really breaks down some of our harder to control weeds, particularly some of our winter annuals and perennials. And it can give us some guidelines on some of the cover crops that we might have. And again, those are on pages 17 for corn and page 53 for soybeans. One of the other things that we really want to point out is when you're doing a burn down application, it is going to be really important to make sure that you have a pre-emergence herbicide in there. Those pre-herbicides are going to basically act as our foundation program to control things like lamb's quarters, and also some of our more resistant weeds, like using metribuzin to help control horseweed, or using some of the group 15 herbicides or Valor, or some of those premixes to help control water hemp. So those are really important. What that also does is provides us more consistent control later in the season. So we have we have more consistent weed heights when we're trying to get our post-emergence herbicides on. It also reduces the number of weeds present, which are really important. and provides that flexibility in post applications. And again, with our pre-herbicides, those are generally going to be applied if you're doing tillage right after tillage or included in that burn down treatment. And in general, we usually like to try to get our burn down treatments on usually around 7 days prior to planting, but it can go up to planting depending on what herbicide program you're looking at. And just to show you a few benefits, and I've shown these before, looking at for horseweed or mare's tail, you can see if you have an effective pre-down, that really helps reduce those uh, populations. And then again, looking at the same thing with water hemp, that effective pre really reduces those numbers so that those post-emergence herbicides work much better. And we do have a listing of all those pre-emergence herbicides that you can use, all the different tank mixes. And again, that is in our tables 1B for corn and 2B for soybeans in the weed control guide. And I'll share that link to where you can find that weed control guide. And there are several of those still available at the MSU Extension bookstore that can be ordered. One of the other things I wanted to touch on briefly is our herbicide applications in winter wheat. In general, we usually want to just make sure that we're making applications when weeds are actively growing. So at this time, we're not seeing a lot of active growth on weeds because of the cooler temperatures. In general, our herbicides can cause some injury to the wheat if the crop is under stress. And sometimes that's from cold, drought, so forth, or even too much rain. When we start really thinking about that, one of the key things to point out is temperature can really cause more injury to winter wheat. So in general, we like to say, do not apply your wheat herbicide when your daily temperature is below 50 degrees. So we want to look at that 50-degree temperature or higher for our applications. And the main reason for this is a good example. This was some work we did a few years ago where we applied these herbicides the morning throughout the day. I think we started applying it when it was probably 30, 39 degrees, 40 degrees. It didn't get much higher than that. And you can see through here, particularly with a lot of our ALS herbicides like Affinity Broad Spect, Osprey Extra, we'd see the same thing with Osprey or Powerflex. You can see where there's some stunting and yellowing. And that was basically from those cold temperatures when those applications are made. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Another thing to consider is the wheat growth size and the weeds controlled. Again, when we get too much canopy closure, sometimes we see that we don't get as much good a coverage on some of those weeds. So keep that in mind. When you plant can also affect that. So these are two timings of wheat planting. You can see the later one, October 24th on the left-hand side and September 23rd on the right-hand side. Couple other things to consider. Your product choices are really going to be dependent on whether you have, for example, frost-seeded red clover out there. Well, you have a lot less choices from a spring application when we have that. And I'll be putting in probably next week an article in the Field Crop News talking about some of the different options and a few things to look out for. And then also whether you're going to use 28% nitrogen as a carrier. That can also cause some more injury. We usually have looked at trying to split those applications for starting early and then kind of waiting until we actually are trying to do more for weed control, usually towards the end of April for that second split. Just to touch on briefly with the cover crop termination, as I mentioned, this last year we had a cover crop termination field day. We had 9 different cover crop species that you can see listed here on the left-hand side of each of the pictures. We did some early termination, and then we did some what we would consider a little bit later. So we started on April 1st last year and then April 15th. One of the things I do want to point out is as you look at these pictures were taken in May. This first strip right here is annual ryegrass, and that was the early application. And then back here is annual ryegrass with the later one, and you can see that that annual ryegrass is controlled particularly way better with those later applications, and I'll tell you why. So last year when we were looking at these termination times, one of the things that really stood out, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with our wheat herbicide applications is when air temperatures are below 50 degrees, a lot of times we're not getting as good a control. And for example, in the wheat, we see too much injury. So our early termination time last year was April 1. You can see that we had some fairly cold temperatures for our max temperatures, but you can see they were very cold for our min temperatures. As we went a little bit further to that April 15th termination time, and again, the time of, of the year is probably not going to matter. It's what you're looking at as far as temperatures. When our temperatures were getting closer to that 50 degrees or higher, we had much better control. And just to show you how that looked, and again, these are all taken the same time. This is 40 ounces of Roundup Power Max 3 applied on April 1st. This is waiting until the 15th when those temperatures are warmer, and this is the combination with Sharpen. Annual ryegrass is a very tough cover crop to terminate, but we can see that there are some potential benefits for waiting. When we look at cereal rye termination, usually cereal rye is pretty easy to terminate with Roundup Power Max or glyphosate. And you can see here on those cooler temperatures, we didn't get complete termination. As we waited when those temperatures were warmer, we had much better termination. And then even with 30 ounces Roundup Power Max, we had great termination. So again, just making sure we're waiting a little bit to make sure that those temperatures are higher. Saw the same thing with Dwarf Essex rapeseed. You can see here, Power Max early, really didn't do much. This is including 2,4-D. We get some better control. This was with the quart rate. We also looked at a pint and saw some good control. This was early, so that 2,4-D is needed for terminating that rapeseed. And then you can see our later applications much better with the Power Max alone at the warmer temperatures. But again, still seeing the benefit of the 2,4-D. And then one of the other things is clovers. Clovers are generally a little bit tougher to terminate. Again, you can see on the left, we have our early termination. Didn't do a great job, probably, fair. Here's our later termination with just glyphosate. When we added Clarity or dicamba, that's where we see the better control. So with that, we were able to come up with some just general recommendations and looking at some of the different products that we looked at. And as you look at most of these different termination or these cover crops, you can see that the early applications in general were not that good. So just waiting until those temperatures are quite a bit warmer, and then we will be able to provide this in an article talking about which ones we would think that, and then also updating our cover crop termination sheet on which ones provided better control. So as you can see, particularly with the annual ryegrass, the higher rate of glyphosate, we also saw, what I would consider good control of that combination with Sharpen had to be warmer. Again, usually when you start thinking about annual ryegrass, you want to make sure it's kind of a time when you're actually would be mowing a lawn. Usually glyphosate's great for cereal rye termination. The crimson clover, again, both crimson and red clover, best when you have dicamba in there. We can get some control, a little bit better control with a higher rate of 2,4-D or waiting until it's warmer at the lower rate of 2,4-D for those. And then you can see we had good control with some of our 2,4-D Clarity and Sharpen combinations to get Austrian winter pea. So with that, a couple of our take-home messages: be prepared with a comprehensive weed management plan. Consider the potential of herbicide-resistant weeds. Make sure you start clean and really thinking about adding those pre-emergence tree or soil-applied herbicides into your programs, and really consider those temperatures, growth stages, and other factors when we're making applications to wheat. And I would also say in trying to terminate your cover crops. So with that, we do have our weed control guide posted on our website. If you go to canr.msu.edu/weeds, that is there. And we'll go ahead and we'll turn it over to Steve to introduce Jeff, I believe.
Awesome, Christy. Great information that we're putting out there this morning. Now we're going to go ahead and move into our question and answer portion of today's virtual breakfast meeting. I'm going to go through the chat in the order received. You can feel free to drop in your question in the chat, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. Our first question is going to be from Gordon, and his question was for looks like Christy. Can Prowl and Reflex be tank mixed as a PPI application for black turtle beans? And if so, what is the desirable number of days prior to planting? Is this application desired?
I would say they could. I would recommend probably not doing that though, because I think having that reflex application more available for your post-emergence use is going to be more important to try to make sure that we get control of common ragweed and also water hemp that might show up. So I would be looking at more putting that reflex post-emergence rather than the incorporated side because we're probably not going to get the type of control that you're going to want.
Perfect. Gordon, I hope that answers your question. The next question is going to be from Mark Seaman. Thanks for this question, Mark. Christy, it seems like the cover of winter annual weeds is not as heavy as recent years. Do you expect that this is fewer weeds or perhaps just less growth that could change quickly as temperatures increase?
I think a lot of it's, Mark, a good question. I think a lot of it's less growth. So I think once, if we start getting those higher temperatures and moisture, those will take off. So those are going to be some things that we're going to have to manage.
Next question is going to be from Clay. And the question is, what impact has the federal administration actions, for example, layoffs, spending freezes, etc., had on climate forecasting? So this might be for Jeff.
Yes, I can certainly start with that. The impact so far, it varies. But there have been a number of people that have lost their jobs. Some of them are former colleagues of mine, and some have been reinstated at least temporarily. It's an evolving situation. However, the bottom line is, and what we all have to, I think the most important thing is here that NOAA, the parent organization of the National Weather Service, and the Climate Prediction Center, NOAA is responsible for the vast majority of operational data gathering and then the processing and model simulation that goes into our numerical, virtually all of our weather and climate. Both it's weather and climate. So our forecast plus some of what we look at here, statistics, they everyone uses the same product, and that's from NOAA. So remember that as NOAA is downsized, or at least that's the plan here, that there will be impacts. They're inevitable, again, the problem is some of this probably it might be commercialized, but ultimately we all use products from NOAA, and it's the reality is you can't make a profit by collecting data. We found that out here with EnviroWeather in Michigan. It's something that we have to have in our and there will be impacts. I guess we can guess at what they are, but they're inevitable. They're just fewer resources to use. So this will have a long and probably noticeable change, or make some long and noticeable changes in our weather and climate services with time as the process evolves.
Yeah, thanks
Steve,
for those.
there
Yeah.
was a question from Jesse early on
Mhm.
that he talked about. Do you have any herbicide application recommendations for intercropping soybeans into wheat?
Yeah, sorry about that, Jesse. I missed you early on in the chat, but I think that question's for Christy about herbicide application recommendations for intercropping soybeans into wheat.
So Jesse, depending on what weed species you have, there are a few herbicides that we can use in both wheat and soybeans, and then just the timing. I'd be happy to, if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to, or give me a call. I'd be happy to discuss what some of those recommendations might fit best for your situation.
Great questions. If there's any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Christy, question for you. The kind of emerging topic in weed control right now is, the water hemp. Just curious how prevalent is that across the state? Are you hearing grower reports of this being a problematic weed? and its growing resistance. What's kind of the state of affairs with that particular noxious weed?
Yeah, right now I would say water hemp is pretty rampant across the state, so you can pretty much find it in most counties. Most of the samples that have been sent into the diagnostic clinic, a majority of those are glyphosate resistant and potentially ALS resistant. So things like First Rate, Classic, those types of herbicides, Pursuit, Raptor. So that's probably the most prevalent. We do have some pockets that have some triazine resistance, and then also some resistance to things like Reflex or Flex Star or Ultra Blazer, which really comes into play as we're looking at dry bean options, non-GMO soybean options. So those are just a few things to keep in mind. So it is one of those things that even if you haven't seen it in your field, I would consider a strategy that is going to take care of it, because it's one of those things that just pops up and a lot of people aren't ready for it. So for a lot of the different recommendations that we've been putting out have really been focusing on making sure that you get some good control of that. So as well as the other weeds that are out there.
So as producers move through this season, if they start seeing sort of this problematic weed arise in their fields, is there anything that they can do from a producer standpoint with MSU Extension to report this, or any sort of guides that they can use? I know you mentioned the weed control guide. Has this modern information been reflected in that guide for 2025 yet?
Yeah, we've got a good kind of fact sheet in the back talking about methods for control. Additionally, if you want testing done, I most of the time we've been doing more bioassays. Dr. Erin Hill in the diagnostic lab has done that, but we have been working with, or she has been working with Eric Patterson, who's our kind of molecular weed scientist, and they have been looking at some more quick test, so on the molecular basis. So if you have a problem and you want some stuff tested, we might be able to do it more on a quick assay test versus having to wait until you get seed and then growing it out in the greenhouse, in which Aaron sprays it.
Awesome. Great to know. I did drop the link to the weeds page at MSU Extension in the chat. And on that page, you can find the 2025 weed control guide, which I believe Christy was referencing in the back. We were talking about with water hemp control. Christy, I did have a few questions pop up. First one's going to be from Chris. Question is, what is your recommendation for herbicide use on black beans on fields with water hemp pressure pre and post?
Great question. So on that front, we've been trying to think about getting a good pre-down. And in general, you can do some group 15s, whether it's Outlook or Dual, where you can split the application. So a lot of times for example, if you're an Outlook user, you would probably put like 10 ounces of Outlook in with maybe Prowl, incorporate it, and then come back with something like Reflex, and then the other half of the Outlook application, like 11 ounces there. So you're splitting those residuals, so you're getting that later season emergence, but that Reflex is in there to help out. You can do the same thing with Dual by using, a pint pre-emergence and then putting a pint of post in with something like Reflex. So.
Yeah, these are some good dry bean questions that have come up. I'm happy to see some dry bean producers in here this morning. Thanks, Christy. We got another question from David. Thanks for your question, David. In wheat last year, he had a patch of thistle come up. It seemed like there were two different times of germination. Some seed heads had matured and others weren't. What can I do to minimize this problem this year?
So, particularly in winter wheat, so that was last year in wheat. One of the options that we do have is Stinger, which is a fairly good herbicide for thistle. In general, you would want that thistle up, but it does translocate down, so it does get into that seed stock. One of the problems with thistle is like you said, you have the different germination times. I'm not sure what you're going to this year, if you're going to soybeans or corn. But we do have actually in the back of the weed guide, we kind of have a 1-page fact sheet talking about some of the different options there. So that's ideally the best time to kind of control it is just before that seed head, the flower comes out. It's kind of in that bud stage, but sometimes depending on the crop, that can be difficult. So in soybeans, pretty much there's glyphosate. You can do some mixtures with 240 if you have like an enlist soybean, but we do have some of those different options listed in the weed guide.
Awesome. And again, that weed guide is in the chat. I also did drop in our website for our plant and pest diagnostics page. This is really helpful if you're out in your fields and you see a particular weed or pest that you're not sure what it is. This can help you with that identification and then also show you the process in which you're going to submit your plant ID request to the university. So that's another helpful resource I wanted to include in the chat for all of our attendees today. We'll do we've got about 4 minutes left. We'll do a last call for any questions. I think this has been an absolutely great start to the virtual breakfast series. Phil and I were chatting before we got started this morning that we're particularly excited. It's a big year for the virtual breakfast series. And I'm excited for our next couple speakers and the rest of the series. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining this morning, from our specialist, Dr. Christy Sprague. Invaluable information early on in the season. We appreciate you being here. And again, Dr. Jeff Andresen, MSU climatologist. Just want to give you a big round of applause and thank you for being here this morning. You're an integral part of this series, and everybody appreciates the help with navigating the weather, Jeff. So appreciate it here this morning. To all of our educators out there and attendees, thank you for joining this morning too. And I think we'll wrap up. We'll see you next Thursday. If you've got any questions or problems that arise with tech or submitting those RUP credits, don't hesitate to reach out to us.